future as a Rolling Stone is very uncertain. My ultimate aim in life was never to be a pop star. I enjoy it, with reservations, but I'm not really sort of satisfied either artistically or personally.
Love 'em or hate 'em, the Rolling Stones has stood the test of time as one of the most influential and boundary-pushing artists in both the rock scene and in music in general. They made waves their hard rock sound, and they never shied away from controversy either. But like all bands, the Rolling Stones have had some rough patches. Perhaps their biggest blow came from their own founding member and former leader, Brian Jones, who ended up leaving the band and tragically dying long before his friends and fellow bandmates. Join us as we explore the absurd life and death of Brian Jones, who created one of the most well-known bands of all time. Brian Jones was born to his parents Louis and Louisa Jones. The Jones family was a middle-class home, and Brian also had two sisters, Barbara and Pamela. However, the happy family would soon suffer a great loss when Pamela died at just 2 years old from leukemia, and this was one of the many rough moments in Jones' early days. At just 4, Jones suffered a viral respiratory infection, which caused him to have asthma that lasted his whole life. Like so many great musicians before and after him, Brian Jones got into music at a young age, and he owed some of his talent to his parents, who were both also musical people on the side. Brian's dad taught piano when he wasn't working on aircrafts, and his mother also played piano and the organ. She was the leader of the choir at the local church, and they say the piano is one of the most fundamental instruments. So Brian's musical parents definitely helped him grow into the legendary musician that he became. After he spent about 4 years at the Dean Close School, Brian moved on to the Cheltenham Grammar School for Boys, where he started playing the clarinet in concert band. His interest and skill in other academics varied. Most of his classes were ordinary level, not advanced or accelerated. Jones displayed characteristics of a talented mind. He could do well in school without trying, or even getting an A in physics, but that same lack of effort caused him to skip out on higher level courses and causing him to completely flunk biology. Whether this is ADHD or just a brilliant brain that had better things to do than to solve equations, we just don't know. He did have some characteristics of these neurotypical people though. He was very anti-establishment and fought against the power of rules and uniforms, and he even got suspended a few times. Of course, this made him look like the cool kid, and that persona would carry over to the Rolling Stones, who elevated that rock star persona. Jones started hanging out with the older kids and listened to classical music, blues, and jazz. Jones's love of jazz inspired him to ask for a saxophone in 1957, and in 1959 he got his first acoustic guitar on his 17th birthday. Jones' talent was already solid, and he started getting small-time gigs at local jazz clubs. Later that same year, Brian got his girlfriend pregnant, and that might have been the start of the Rolling Stones' very open sexuality in their performances, their lyrics, and their image. Jones was dating Valerie Corbett at the time, and he suggested she terminate the pregnancy, which was even more controversial back then. Valerie gave birth to Barry David Corbett, but placed him up for adoption. Jones seemed shaken by the whole ordeal, and the baby out of the wedlock up for an adoption also caused huge social pressure on him in high school, of all places, where drama is already at a lifetime high for most people. He ended up quitting school and ran away from home. Like a real-life Rolling Stone, he roamed around Europe and sang and played guitar on street corners and bars, otherwise called busking. He was homeless, but did his best to entertain, to make a little scratch wherever he could. However, his solo street style wouldn't support him, and he eventually went broke and went back to his family in England. Despite returning home, Jones was still as spontaneous as ever. During a concert in Guildford, he met a girl named Angeline who was married. His bad boy devil, may-care attitude won her over, and the two had a one-night stand. And Jones knocked up another woman in just 1 year. Angeline kept the baby, named Belinda, but she never told Brian. A few years later, Brian tried to get his life together by applying for a scholarship to the Cheltenham Art College. He got accepted, but his reputation from 3 years prior returned to haunt him, and someone wrote a letter to the college calling Jones an irresponsible drifter. Apparently, that was enough to make them reject his application. Jones continued to play music and slay the hearts of women all around him. In October of 1961, his girlfriend Pat Andrews gave birth to Julian Mark Andrews, Jones' third child with 3 different women in just 3 years. His heart seemed to be in the right place since he sold his own vinyl records to buy clothes for Julian, but his work life was still spotty and not really enough to support a family. Shortly after Julian was born, Brian moved in with Pat. 3 years after his third son, Jones had a fourth son also named Julian with a woman named Linda Lawrence. Lawrence would eventually find a different musician and raise Jones's child with him instead. Jones's love life would continue to be crazy, but things really started to change for him after he moved out of Pat's place and headed to London. In London, Jones made lots of friends that would change his life forever. He continued to hang out in blues and jazz clubs, where he met up with Paul Jones, who would later sing for the band Manfred Mann, Jack Bruce, the bassist of the psych rock legends Cream, and also solo artist Alexis Corner. During this period of time, Brian started a solo blues project and called himself M.L. Lewis, and he used a technique called slide guitar. While most people think of a guitar using a pick, slide guitarists use a smooth sleeve on their string hand that helped create sliding sounds. Jones was immersed in the music scene, and he also joined a group called the Roosters with his friend Paul. In another crazy twist, Paul and Brian left the band in 1963, and another legendary guitarist named Eric Clapton joined the Roosters in Brian's place. Jones would try to bring more musicians into the fold, and Ian Stewart answered his advertisement and joined Paul and Jones as a pianist, and then singer Mick Jagger would answer the call, followed by Jagger's childhood friend Keith Richards, who also played the guitar. One day, Brian was on the phone trying to set up a venue for the band to perform, and the owner asked who they were, and he came up with the name, Rolling Stones, on the spot. The story goes there was a small vinyl single from the band Muddy Waters laying on the ground, and the name of the single was Rolling Stone Blues. The band would later add the G to form the legendary name, the Rolling Stones. The band played their first show on July 12th of 1962 in London at the Marquee Club. For the next year, Jones stayed with Richards and Jagger in a flat in Chelsea, where they would spend all day listening to music and playing music. And that year, they had met bassist Bill Wyman, and the three wanted to invite him to the band because he always had cigarettes and a spare amp. Wyman also built his own bass, which impressed the other members. Then they got Charlie Watts to play drums for them. Charlie was making a name for himself as one of the best jazz drummers in the city, so he clearly saw something in the Rolling Stones. Brian spearheaded the group, and his ability to play any instrument was huge for the band's writing process, while still using his slide technique on a variety of the Stones' early songs. He played harmonica and did backing vocals for Jagger on classics like Sympathy for the Devil. Richard even claims that Brian helped create a composing technique called guitar weaving, where the rhythm and lead will trade parts between the two, and this technique is found on tons of projects. Once the members were assembled, Jones took over the role of the band's business manager and started labeling the group R&B. Jones got the equivalent of 145 pounds or $270 more than the other members because he was managing them and setting up their gigs. Other members got upset about that and were often confused when they found out because they thought other people were doing the management work. So, the band found Andrew Oldham to be their new manager, which upset Jones. And Andrew brought more chaos by suggesting the group follow the Beatles' blueprint by giving each other single tracks to boost their income. The new manager told Jones not to see Pat or his son Julian. Brian thought it would be temporary, and once the band took off, he'd be able to return. But his fame turned him away from the common life of Pat and Julian. Brian never came back to Pat and didn't pay her any child support. She became bitter about the guitarist, but later felt sorry for him and the tragic life he was leading. As Brian Jones became more and more separated from his original role and his version of the band, he willingly distanced himself in other ways. He traveled to shows separately from the other members and stayed at different hotels. And even though he used to live with Richards and Jagger, he started to flip his perspective on the group vibe. As the band got more and more successful, Jones was distanced even more from his former life. Everything was piling up. So Jones resorted to drugs and alcohol, which harmed his emotional and psychological health even more and more, and his life began to spiral down.
Fame doesn't sit very comfortably on anyone's shoulders. But some people's shoulders it doesn't seem to sit on at all. And he was one of them, and I don't think it suited him.
But within a very short amount of time, another guy was coming out, a Mimi. Starter, and somebody you didn't suspect lurked in there, and this guy got bigger and bigger as the years went by. and also became more self-destructive. Now, I'm one to talk about that, right? But I'm still here, you know?
There was a ray of hope for Jones, though. The Stones were touring in 1965 when Brian met Anita Pallenberg backstage. She was a model and actress who was well connected. She knew one of the most influential artists of the century, Andy Warhol, and she started a relationship with Brian. The relationship was serious for him, but then another crushing blow hit Jones farther, driving off the rift between him and the band had started. Jones was with Anita for 2 years, and in March of 1967, Jones, Richards, and Anita went to Morocco for a short vacation. But once they got there, Jones got stuck in the hospital. While he was recovering, Anita left him for Richards. Brian had a few more relationships and even tried to pull a media cover-up on yet another of his children conceived out of wedlock. Eventually, he met Anna Wolin, who lived with Brian until his last day. Jones stopped working on songwriting and recording as much as he used to, and he even stopped playing the guitar in favor of the sitar and other new instruments that he hadn't played before. That same year, he was arrested for drugs, and he had 3 different substances with him at the time. He worked on Beggar's Banquet, but after that, he barely worked with the Rolling Stones. Jones' last appearance with the band was on December of 1968 for the group's Rock and Roll Circus, which fused circus acts with rock performances. This same show, which was both crazy and totally unique, went unreleased for over 25 years because Jagger thought it didn't hold up to other artists of the time. After that performance, Jones got caught with pot again, but he barely avoided a long jail sentence. By this point, Jones' drug use was so bad that when he tried to play the harmonica, his mouth would bleed. At the start of their 1969 US tour, the Rolling Stones kicked their founder from the band and replaced him with Mick Taylor. This is where we get into the 27 Club.
The so-called 27 Club. It's a name for a group of musicians who all died at the age of 27.
So Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Kurt Cobain, and Amy Winehouse are just a few of the iconic musicians who helped define rock and roll before taking their own lives at 27 years old. Did you know that?
July 3rd of 1969, Brian was found dead in his pool, unresponsive. He was only 27 years old. To this day, people wonder if he was actually murdered. Who was actually present on that fateful night? Strangely enough, there were many people present on that night of his passing, none of which seemed to have noticed him in the water until it was too late. There were 3 people present: Brian's girlfriend, Anna Wolin, Brian's builder, Frank Thorogood, and Jeanette Lawson, who was Tom Keelock's girlfriend, the band's fix-it man. Anna. What could her motivation be? With all the money and love she could want, what would motivate her to do such a thing? According to her statements, he was a very kind and gentle man. He had been given up on drinking and on doing illegal substances. It wouldn't really make sense for her to do that. However, everyone who was present that night was intoxicated, including herself. That couldn't possibly be the full reason. Although Brian remained unmarried, he did have children from previous relationships. This could possibly have put strife on the couple, leading to her inevitably acting on her jealousy. The next suspect is Frank Thorogood. Not only was he present at the party that evening, but he was in the pool with Brian. His motivations line up. There had been a lot of stress buildup between the two of them. Frank had been employed as the band's repairman. As time went on, Frank had elected to move himself into the estate in order to ease the workload. He also elected to bring his girlfriend to live with them while he worked on repairs. However, soon after moving in, the workload began to decrease. He was constantly partying and little work was being done. This led to frustration with Brian, as he was paying for repairs and little was changed. Frank not only disregarded his work and partied, but began opening accounts and buying things under Brian's name, all secretly without consent of Brian. Heated arguments over the payments were common. Frank believed Brian was withholding money from him. He was under the influence, angry and bitter. A conversation could have easily happened between the two in the pool. Brian could have broke the news to Frank, leading to his own demise. According to the autopsy report, it was alcohol and substance related, a misadventure, an accidental drowning. As there were no marks of struggle on the body, no scrapes, scratches, bumps, or bruises, no broken bones, no damage to the body, doctors at the time agree with the report and the case has been closed. What likely happened was Frank and Brian were partying in the pool. Being that both were intoxicated, Brian could have the urge to cough, as he was inhaling abrasive compounds. While being held under, he coughs a few times, causing the water to flood in and knock him unconscious. This could explain why none of the others paid attention. Frank could have thought he was playing until the body was unresponsive for too long. Tom Keelock admitted to it. 40 years after his demise, he too met his end. Although admitting to this, he wasn't present at the day of the event. People assume this is a cover-up, as well as he met his end on the 40th year anniversary after keeping his mouth shut for so long. Did he fear the consequences? Or did guilt finally make him fess up? His brother was a member of Scotland Yard and called for the case to be closed, even after he fessed up. This wasn't the first time he admitted guilt. Many blamed depression. He obviously felt guilty for what had happened. Whether he was guilty or not proves fruitless. One could go back to the moment of the incident and witness the truth of the tragedy, and nothing of impact the decision, as Brian didn't struggle. He had passed away moments before his head dipped below the surface. As such, the case is to remain closed. Two days after his death, the Rolling Stones performed a free concert in honor of their founder and former friend. And that's the story of how one man's vision brought together some of the most talented musicians in rock and roll history, only to fall apart and die way before his time.